Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. This webinar is part of a series based on my book, The Age of Sustainability, which came out last year. This particular webinar is based on chapter 3. We have had 4 webinars up until now. End of last year, we did the chapter on chapter 9, which was entitled Resisting Transition, Authoritarianism, Energy Dominance, and Electro-Masculinity. And then we have done the introduction, chapter 1, and chapter 2, which is a kind of meta-theoretical framework. So the focus of chapter 3 and therefore this talk is really the work of the International Resource Panel. And I'm going to be using what I really don't like using, which is a PowerPoint presentation, because a lot of what I am communicating is quite a lot of information and data drawing from the various reports of the International Resource Panel. But I think it's important to just make a brief introductory comment to contextualize this chapter in the wider narrative of the book. Essentially, what I'm trying to build up in the book is a theory of change that is appropriate to a global South context, and in particular an African context. But it's a global story, and I understand change in the context of long waves of transition, working at multiple levels, and I'm interested in a theory of change that validates radical incrementalism rather than a faith in some kind of sudden rupture, some kind of revolutionary rupture, or a belief somehow that there's going to be a global collapse. I'm interested in the complex dynamics of transition. So chapter 3, the aim of chapter 3 is really to focus on the work of the International Resource Panel, which is the baby sister of sustainability science. So the big sister is obviously climate science associated with the IPCC. Then there is ecosystem science associated with the Intergovernmental Panel on IPBES, Intergovernmental Biodiversity Ecosystem Change, and then the International Resource Panel, which is really focused on resource flows. So the IRP was set up in 2007, just after the fourth assessment report of the IPCC. And there is a link. I mean, the fourth assessment report really, one of its key arguments was that the global economy will need to change if we are going to address the climate change issue. But the majority of people in the IPCC are climate scientists. And so UNEP, together with the EU, raised the question, well, would it be possible to start thinking about the transformation of the global economy from a resource flow perspective? And that's really what I want to highlight. It's not to in any way diminish the significance of climate science or ecosystem science. It's really to say that even if there wasn't global warming, the planet is falling apart, and that's got a lot to do with resources. And although the idea of decoupling has been seriously criticized, in particular from quarters within the social sciences, no matter what your ideological position, no matter whether we have the continuation of a more humane capitalism or a post-capitalist or socialist future, whatever the future looks like ideologically, and whichever social group is favored, the it's really impossible to think about the future without decoupling well-being in particular, and growth where it is required, from the continuously rising accumulation and use of resources. So that's really what I want to focus on in this presentation, and I'm going to just switch to a PowerPoint presentation. In the opening of the chapter, I really just reflect on energy resources and human civilization in general terms. What we call human civilization is really a set of socioeconomic systems, and that is dependent on a set of biophysical systems that we call nature. And what the resource flow perspective really does is track the flow of resources from natural systems into socioeconomic systems and out of those socioeconomic systems. What Gianpietro, the Spanish academic, refers to in the title of his book, The Metabolic Pattern of Society. So this is a linear metabolism, as it is referred to. You're extracting, using, and wasting. And the question is, can that start to become more circular? But to relate this to chapter 2, socioeconomic systems are what Prigogine called dissipative structures. Basically, essentially what this means is that we have that socioeconomic systems or human civilization is really the gradual buildup of increasingly complex systems, socioeconomic, socio-technical systems for accumulating and holding exergy, which is the usable part of energy, and the resources that are derived from nature, driven by population growth and the accumulation of wealth. And over time, the biophysical conditions that human civilization depends on gets depleted. And we get to a point where these biophysical conditions can no longer serve human civilization as we know it. So if human civilization is to survive, it therefore follows it has to change its relationship to natural systems, and in particular the way resources are used. Now that's a very broad rendition of the sustainability challenge in the language of the first and second law of thermodynamics. But what the integrated resource plan does is empirically document the dynamics of this this increasing disconnect between nature, the biophysical systems that previously were able to supply seemingly on an unlimited basis the natural resources that are required and the sinks that are required for the waste. And that is no longer the case as those resources become more expensive and as the cost of wasting into sinks becomes more expensive, and we shift from a virtuous to a vicious cycle. So that's basically what the RIP seeks to do, but it has yet to develop a theory of transition. It's essentially documented the end of industrial modernity as we know it from a resource cycle perspective, and it's the RIP meets every 6 months. I've been on it since the beginning, and at the next meeting, which I think is next week, obviously online, we will be considering a proposal written by myself and Helga Weiss from Germany to develop a paper on transition that deals with the question of transition. This is the website if you want to follow it up. So in the crudest possible terms, what the IRP is essentially doing is documenting the sustainability challenge from a materials point of view, from a resources point of view. The IPCC has done that with respect to carbon emissions. And this is in an unequal world. So, you know, the status quo is roughly 10 tons, an average of 10 tons of resources consumed per capita, with some countries up to 35, 40, and others at 3 or 4. Obviously in an unequal world, and similarly with CO2 emissions, some countries at 25 tons, others at a couple of tons. And if we are looking at a sustainable world, it's probably converging at around 6 tons per capita, and as the IPCC has argued, a 2 ton per capita CO2 life in a more equal world without poverty, la SDG 1, and so on. So this is in very, very crude terms, the crudest possible terms in numbers, what this transition, resource transition, looks like. One of I think this was the second report that the panel published, Decoupling Natural Resource Use and Environmental Impacts from Economic Growth. Together with Marina Fischer-Kowalski from the Institute for Social Ecology in Vienna, I was a co-lead author of this report. And really what this report does is say, okay, we have information on for a century, stretching back to the beginning of the 20th century. We have information on the total quantity of fossil fuels we've used, of construction minerals, of metal ores and industrial minerals, and biomass. And all of these can be measured in tons and put onto the same graph. And you could see it, you'll be able to see the totals. Obviously, what a key resource that's missing here is water. But when you measure water in tons, it just completely annihilates the other 4 resource packages, and you can't present them together. And I'll come to those representations in a minute. But just to using a picture from the International Biennale Rotterdam from 2014, which I was involved in, what you have here. Here's a very interesting drawing, which essentially says, okay, these are the resources that are coming into the urban system. These are the resources that come out of the system. These are the resources which get sunk in concrete, sunk in system in use. And these are some of the emissions coming out of the top. And there's also resources like radiation that comes into the system and energy. So this is just, I think, just a really nice graph to kind of depict the linearity of the urban metabolism. So just to put this into historical perspective, the work of Marina Fischer-Kowalski in her book, Socio-Ecological Transitions and Global Change, really, in my view, sets the kind of conceptual and historical framing of this work, and essentially argues that roughly 15,000 years ago, when we had the agricultural revolution, we shifted from the use of temporary spaces, meat, wild food, and fire, to the deployment of soils, land, building materials, water, biomass, etc., to create the grand agricultural civilizations that predated the industrial era. And then roughly 250 years ago, the beginning of the industrial era, where the species start to develop the technologies for accessing and deploying fossil fuels, minerals and metals, about 8.7 billion hectares of land. And we extract, actually, it's the latest data is 140 billion tons of stuff as of 2010, plus pollution, particularly CO2 and other problematic wastes. And so the argument is essentially that if there have been socio-metabolic transitions in the past, 15,000 years ago, 250 years ago, then it's conceivable that we will have another socio-metabolic transition where we'll be using less fossil fuels, there will be less pollution, we will be more efficient use of materials, but we'll be using a whole pile of stuff that we don't currently use very much, in particular renewable energy. So this is the historical kind of framing using long wave theory to contextualize the work of the IRP. And basically what the IRP is doing is documenting in my argument, not necessarily in the view of everybody on the IRP, the end of the industrial epoch and the preconditions for a sustainability era. And as I said, the work is now going to begin on understanding the dynamics of this transition. So if you look at empirically resource use since 1900, basically we go from roughly 8 billion tons in 1900 to by the year 2005, roughly 60 billion tons. And if you then track on top of that the growth in GDP, as you can see, GDP growth has been at a faster rate, especially since the 1960s, than resource use. And this gap between GDP growth and resource growth is called relative decoupling. So there's already a kind of decoupling here, which is relative. And what that essentially means is that by the turn of the millennium, you require fewer resources for the same amount of GDP, or put differently, there's an escalation of GDP that is faster than resource consumption. If you look at the more updated numbers that the IRP has published through to 2010, going back to the 1970, it's like roughly 25 billion tons in 1970, rising to 70 billion tons by 2010. So you can see our previous report was we were at 60 billion tons, and now we're at 70 billion tons of material extraction. And what needs to be made clear is, as you can see, this is non-metallic minerals, it's metallic ores, it's fossil fuels and biomass, but this is the used extraction. What we actually extract about double this, about 140 billion tons. We throw away half, and that's really the environmental impact of extraction. We actually use the other half, and a substantial portion of that ends up in waste. If you look at this from a per capita point of view, global material extraction per capita, going from just over 6 tons per capita in 1970 through to an average of 10 tons. And as I say, some countries like North America, normally kind of large industrial countries that are a relatively low density, are at about 25 to 30 tons per capita. And industrialized countries that are high density, like in Europe, are about half that. And then obviously it all depends on your levels of economic development. What is significant is that during the course of the 20th century, resource prices have basically steadily declined, but that changes in the year 2000. And basically from the year 2000, what we have is a steady increase in resource prices. And although resource prices go up and down, as we know, there was a peak around the time of the global recession, and the recession, the global financial crisis, 2007, 8, 9, triggered a drop in resource prices. There's been a steady increase, which was then affected by the next global financial economic crisis, which was last year. But those people who are watching resource prices predict a super cycle of maybe 40, 50 years of rising resource prices, which hasn't really happened consistently over the last 2 centuries. So there has been innovation in this whole world of resource flow analysis. And this was the kind of seminal article that generated what is now called the material footprint of nations. And this is a fundamentally different methodology, and it's premised on the assumption that when you looked at European, let me just back up a bit. When you look at European countries, they looked like they were decoupling. But what was actually happening is that the production of their material requirement was basically being exported to countries with cheaper labor, and then they became more dependent on imports. And so then the question became, what is the actual material footprint of a country like Germany, for example, which may, or France, or any of these European countries that may be importing more and producing relatively less. And what this team essentially did, which has now been more or less incorporated into the work of the IRP, is to say that the ecological rucksack of the imported goods needs to be allocated to the importer and not to the exporter. So if you, for example, import a can of beans into a European country, normally you would simply just quantify the beans in the can and add that to the material consumption of that economy, and all the materials that's gone into making the can of beans is allocated to the country where the beans are grown and the manufacturing process takes place to produce the can of beans. But those beans are not consumed there, and so the material footprint of nations says, okay, the ecological rucksack, in other words, the resources required to make the can of beans, must be allocated to the importing country and not to the exporting country. And the result is this map. So as you can see here on the left-hand side, you have the material footprint per capita in tons per capita. And so the lowest material footprint is Africa and India. And then you have the kind of 5 to 10 tons in slightly lighter colors. And then the orange to red, North America, Australia, and Europe. So it's on the basis of this that the decoupling report mounted the argument that it's necessary to make a distinction between resource decoupling and impact decoupling. Impact decoupling is the traditional concept, traditional concept of decoupling. Decoupling your well-being or your economic activity from environmental impact, and with a view to really significantly reducing your environmental impact. Resource decoupling is really the decoupling of resource use from economic activity, GDP growth, if you need it, which is not true for everywhere, but definitely from human well-being across the board. And given the upward curves that I've just shown you, when by focusing on this idea of decoupling, one starts to get to the very core of what the work of the IRP is about. In order to substantiate the case, in that first report, there was a slightly different version of this table. So the baseline was 60 billion tons, as I showed you. On a per capita basis, that's 8 tons per capita. If we say that developed countries should freeze at that level, in other words, freeze at the level of, say, a European country at 16 tons per capita, and everybody else catches up to 16 tons per capita, so this is where you would end up, then what you would require is about 140 billion tons of stuff, kind of more than double of what would be required, even with some sustainable resource use. If, however, you said to developed countries, no, you've got to go down from whether it's 25, 30 in North America or 16 in Europe, and you have to cut down to 8 tons per capita, and everybody catches up to that, then what you're looking at is leveling off at about 70 billion tons. But if you want to run the world according to the science of the IPCC, which every country in the world has signed off on, then you've got to average, you've got to level off at about 6 tons per capita on average for everybody, which would basically allow the world to stay at current levels of resource consumption, which is also already causing stress on the biophysical systems. But in economic and resource use terms, it's a pretty radical option. So you can divide the IRP's work into clusters. Decoupling 1, which is what I just referred to, decoupling 2, which I'll get to, and the report on environmental impacts. Then there's a whole bunch of work on nexus issues, cities, food systems, trade, and green energy impacts, which I'll come to. And then specific resource challenges, like a lot of work on metals and some work on ecosystem services, land and water. So the environmental impact assessment, assessing the environmental impacts of consumption and production, priority products and materials. And like there are quite a number of experts on the panel. I think there are around just over 30 members of the panel now from 25, 26, 27 countries. And many of them are industrial ecologists. And industrial ecology over the last 20, 30 years has really become mainstream, and the key methodology is life cycle analysis. And life cycle analysis is a methodology for analyzing the use of resource materials in particular industrial sectors. So using life cycle analysis, this particular research team analyzed, what sectors are the biggest contributors to global greenhouse gas emissions, including land use and land cover. So this is a fairly familiar picture, but what is not always that clear is that transport, housing, and food are across the board in developed and developing countries the biggest contributors to personal consumption and energy use measured in kilowatt hours per capita. So from a policy and strategy point of view, if you can change the transport, housing, and food systems, you're basically dealing with 60 to 70% of the challenge. The Decoupling 2 report, as it's called, explored what is meant by decoupling and basically argued that there are 3 conceptions of decoupling. Decoupling through maturation, which is those graphs that I showed you where you have a GDP per capita rising at faster than a resource use per capita. So it's in a sense a natural, almost like a natural tendency towards relative decoupling. The second is decoupling through burden shifting, which is basically moving your resource-intensive industries out of your country to another country. So it kind of creates the appearance of decoupling. And then there's intentional decoupling to improve resource productivity. And the focus of this particular report was on a range of alternatives. And I'll just give some examples. Using known technologies, it was demonstrated empirically that energy and water demand in developed countries could be reduced by between 50 and 80%. In developing countries, investing in new infrastructure can reduce demand by 50% over 12 years using renewable energy and energy efficiency rather than traditional fossil fuels. There's a potential for an annual resource savings of between $2.9 and $3.7 trillion if investments were made in these more resource efficient infrastructures and systems. And the key instrument that is advocated in this report to achieve this level of resource efficiency is a resource tax, the new resource tax. And basically, a bit like the carbon taxes are being introduced in the South African context, you start off relatively low and you gradually increase the resource tax over time, which is basically a tax on the amount of resources you use. And that, using the basic price mechanism, forces greater levels of efficiency. Now, I have chaired the city working group of the resource panel, which has produced 2 reports: city level decoupling, urban resource flows and the governance of infrastructure transitions, and the weight of cities report, resource requirements of future urbanization, which was published in 2018. And essentially what this report does is take as a point of departure the near doubling of the size of the urban population as estimated by the demographers, especially the UN ones, during the 40-year period 2010 to 2050, but also recognizing that most of the countries in Asia have reached the intersection point between urban population and the rural. And the Latin American countries, the urban is long ago, they've long ago passed that and are majority urban. And Africa is going to reach that point in 2030. But on the whole, if you look at the green lines, it's declining, the red lines are rising. And in the context of that, what we basically now know is that the global sustainability challenges, and in particular, the resource decoupling, will be faced in cities, with special reference to the role infrastructure plays. And India, China, and Nigeria account for 37% of all additional urban growth. So if you get it right in those 3 countries, you've got a big chunk of the solution. Now, this figure here really just highlights the significance of this story. China used more cement in the last 3 years, 2011 to 2013, than the US used in the entire 20th century. And there you can see 4.5 gigatons in the 20th century in the US, 6.6 gigatons in 3 years in China. And if you look at the African context, there's 400 million people living in cities. It's estimated to increase by another 800 million to 1.2 billion. And if everybody aspires to live in concrete, in cement, then you can imagine the resource impact that is going to have. So it's important. Infrastructure matters, and this is being registered by all sorts of major players. Here's the Boston Consulting Group talking to their clients, advocating investments in infrastructure. Investor-ready cities, all about infrastructure, published by Siemens, PwC, and a UK law firm. A cement company addressing the urbanization challenge, focus on infrastructure. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the Urban Infrastructure Initiative, and the WWF financing the transition, sustainable infrastructure in cities. So I'm just putting these up just to kind of basically make the argument. There's many of these kinds of reports basically saying infrastructure is the name of the game. And I'm on the board of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and that's also our core business. Investing in infrastructure and how to make that sustainable is obviously a big challenge. But there's a major opportunity here. So the Global Commission on Climate and Economy estimated that $90 trillion expenditure on infrastructure can be envisaged for the 15 years leading up to 2030. And their estimate is that 5% extra would result in the decarbonization of that new infrastructure. So what does a more sustainable city look like? Well, this is, from a resource point of view, this is the linear metabolism of an unsustainable urban system. And what you see here in graphical terms is a circular economy, or a circular metabolism, where you source fewer virgin materials you recycle a lot more and use it more efficiently, and you minimize your waste outputs. So another way of presenting this, and this is if you just look at energy and materials from an urbanization point of view, in the early phases of urbanization, you have a rise in materials, material use, in particular cement and building sand, and steel and all the other materials that you need to kind of build infrastructures, and peaking during the stabilization, slowing down of the urbanization rate, and then gradually as after that, basically your material use is incremental. And in some cities with fairly stable populations, that amounts to about 2%. But that tends to correlate with rising energy use as you build an increasingly middle-class city. This is all premised on the assumption that economic growth is supposed to work, that it does, and be more inclusive. But obviously, that's not true for all world regions. So this is really a kind of ideal type. But this is what drives unsustainability, unsustainable resource use. You build infrastructures in such a way that for them to operate, you need a high level of energy use. And this is basically resource-intensive, energy-intensive urbanization. So to conceptualize the alternative, it would essentially be say, okay, how do you build cities? Focusing on the weight of cities, how heavy your city is, how heavy is your city. Then what you're looking at is changing the design and building with fewer materials, and doing that in such a way that you end up with a much lower energy requirement. So in very, very crude terms, this is kind of sustainable resource use in a more resource efficient city. So what you have here, I don't know how to get rid of the top part, is some modeling work that we did for the Weight of Cities report. And basically what we show is that urban DMC, the domestic material consumption, the urban component is 40 billion tons in 2010 over here. And this is about 50% of total DMC in 2010, which was just over 70 billion tons in total. So 40 billion tons is consumed in cities. And our estimate is that for these different world regions, on a business as usual basis, in other words, if we continue to design, build, and operate cities as we currently do it, this will go up from 40 billion tons to 89 billion tons. The number is up there at the top. And that would result in an average of 12 tons per capita per year on average in a highly unequal world. So it would still have slums. So this represents 116% increase in urban material consumption relative to a population increase of 78% compared to 2010 by 2050. So what you can see here on a business as usual basis, what the growth of cities, if left unchanged, is basically going to blow the fuses of the planet. But it's not just resource consumption that matters when it comes to future urbanization. There's also a question of land use. So cities basically covered about 1 million square kilometers in 2010, and if the 100-year tendency of sprawl, of de-densification, and outward sprawl of cities is allowed to continue on a business as usual basis, this is going to grow to 2.5 million square kilometers by 2050, and a lot of that expansion will be into the most productive farmland, which is the farming land surrounding cities. So there's a direct clash between the tendency towards de-densification and sprawl on the one hand, and food security on the other. These two cannot be reconciled. So the target should be to remain within the 1.5 million square kilometer boundary, and the target for resource consumption should be to at least half total resource consumption, and then you can move cities into a more sustainable direction. And can you do that? We focused on energy efficient commercial buildings, bus rapid transit systems, district energy systems. We wanted to include waste, but there wasn't enough data. But just with those three, we were able, using life cycle analysis and comparative studies of 84 cities, we were able to show, yes, just with these three, you could significantly reduce total resource consumption in cities of the future. And these are just two examples. The top right-hand side is New York's biogas digesters, basically just capturing, putting all your sewage into these beautiful egg-shaped cylinders, and generating methane gas, which is then fed back into the city gas system. And at the bottom left-hand side is the bus rapid transit system in Lagos. Just two examples of infrastructure investments that have significant resource impacts. In terms of land use, here are two cities. On the left-hand side is Atlanta in the USA. On the right-hand side is Barcelona, both of them roughly 5 million people. But Atlanta is an example of sprawl. Barcelona is an example of high density living. And basically the point of this image is to say it can be done. So just moving on to green energy, there's a report called Green Energy Choices: the benefits, risks, and trade-offs of low carbon technologies for electricity production. Again, using life cycle analysis to compare wind power, hydropower, photovoltaics, CSP, geothermal power, natural gas, combined cycle power with and without CO2 capture and storage, and coal-fired power with and without CCS. So as we all know, wind, PV, CSP, hydro, and geothermal power generate greenhouse gases over the life cycle of less than 50 grams per CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. Coal is around 800 to 1,000 over the same life cycle. If you bring in, if you look at gas combined cycle power without CCS, then you're looking at 500 to 600, just a little bit less than coal. And there's some debate about whether that's true. Some scientists are saying, no, if you include fugitive gases, it's more or less the same as coal. Yes, carbon capture and storage can reduce emissions by between 200 and 300 grams, but with much higher costs, up to a third more costs. And the pollution impacts of renewable energy, obviously, in terms of CO2 emissions, are 70 to 90% less. But renewable energy would result in an increased use of steel, cement, and copper in comparison to the continuation of business as usual fossil fuels, plus an increased use of rare earth metals such as indium and tellurium. So this is not a popular result. This was a very controversial report amongst in the sustainability world, and the renewable energy lobby didn't like it. But that's the reality. And if you do the detailed maths, you will see that is true because of the decentralized nature of these infrastructures. If, however, you've got a renewable energy grid and you're making steel off a renewable energy grid, at least it's green steel. But still, this just makes the point that there's no such thing as clean energy. Food, from a food security to a food system perspective, which is what the IRP has done, we've moved away from only focusing on quantity to the dynamics of the food system as a whole. There's 900 million chronically undernourished people, 2 billion people suffering from nutrient deficiencies, and this is not a problem of production. but how the global food system works. And the key drivers of increased demand is population growth, urbanization, and improved welfare. And this is the diagram really at the center of that report, which basically says, in the top two boxes, these are the environmental impacts, these are the natural resource drivers, this is the way the system is configured, which has this impact on and uses natural resources in certain ways with these negative environmental impacts. And these are the socioeconomic drivers, which is really about social welfare. So the opportunities lie in changing the way farmers operate, changing the way in which the food system works, changing the way in which waste is deployed, but also changing the diets at this level if you are interested in a reduction in the impacts both at a resource level and an environmental impact level. It's a complex story because it's a nexus story with multiple empirics. As far as strategies are concerned, improve yields per hectare, yes. Shift to agroecological farming, reduce losses and wastes along the value chain, and reduce meat and dairy intake and diets. Those were the strategies that were advocated. In terms of trade, there's a report on trade in material flows from a resource point of view. Physical trade measured in material consumption over the period 1980 to 2010 shows a very significant increase in the total quantity of materials traded. So here, the big one here is fossil fuels, especially from the kind of mid-90s, early 90s onwards, but also metals, minerals, and biomass to some extent. So what's interesting about this report is that it's not just significant that the international trade in materials has grown by 28%, but the number of resource exporting countries is shrinking, and the number of resource importing countries is expanding. And obviously, if you project that into the future, it's not a sustainable way to go. These are the resource exporters, and these are the resource importers. So this is back to the material footprint, which actually is a picture of global resource flows. So it's the rucksacks that are allocated to the importers and not to the exporters. But I don't have time to go into that. So what's really interesting is two trends which are potentially mutually reinforcing. So within developed countries, especially in the EU, there's a focus on resource efficiency strategies. So the European Union actually has got a resource efficiency policy framework. And in developing countries, but also in a country like the USA, there is what one can call, and what is called by quite a number of African leaders, resource nationalism. How African countries in particular, which were heavy dependence on resource exports, can beneficiate and better use their resources for their own benefits rather than just extracting, exporting, and collecting the rents. But there's countries like the USA with its shale gas revolution that has basically joined that band and saying we want to depend less on imported oil and more on our own fossil fuels, which is over the last decade or so has been gas. But where's this heading? More and more resource efficiency in developed countries, more and more resource nationalism in developing countries. Can this be mutually reinforcing? In other words, as developed countries import less, does it make more sense for developing countries to depend more on beneficiating, especially if prices start going down? And the obvious answer is yes, but we haven't seen evidence of that really on a significant scale. So when it comes to metals, there were a number of reports, metal stocks in society, in other words, how much metal there is in society, how much is recycled, what opportunities are there for metals recycling, what are the environmental risks and challenges of anthropogenic metal flows and cycles, in other words, the environmental risks and challenges, and then a working paper on long-term geological stocks of metals, in other words, how much is left to extract. So this is a really significant graph, which is really all these metals here that you see on the left-hand side, and what demand has looked like over the last 1.5 centuries. And as you can see, from the 1960s onwards, which is also corresponding with the second wave of urbanization, and mainly in the global south on a massive scale, this is what happens to demand for metals across the board. Massive demand for metals. If you look at the elements that are incorporated into the average computer chip, this is what you needed to make a chip in the 80s. You needed plus 4 more elements in the 1990s, and by the 2000s, you add another 45 elements. So all of these colored elements on the elemental table are now used in our electronics, if they have computer chip. And the electronic age is actually the age of the mobilization of a much, much greater range of metals than has ever been used before. But at the same time, what we are seeing with regards to key ore grades is a decline in the ore grades over this period, which you maybe can't see that clearly, basically from the end of the 19th century through into the beginnings of the 21st century. You can see a decline in metal. And what this really boils down to is you need a lot more stuff. You need to extract a lot more stuff to get the same amount out. And that clearly pushes up the prices. But technologies have also improved, which have counteracted that. But nevertheless, we see a rise in super cycle beginning in 2000 of rising resource prices, and including metals. So when you look at the impacts, the environmental impacts of metals, 7 to 8% of global energy use, and therefore energy-related greenhouse gas emissions, can be attributed to metals production. Declining ore quality means 3 times more material must be removed today to extract a kilogram of ore. The implications for development is that the average consumption, for example, of aluminium in 2000-2006 was 80 kilograms per capita, with a range of 350 to 500 for developed economies and 35 for least developed economies. So if you're measuring development through metal consumption, you can see there's a massive gap, 10% of developed of consumption. If you look at copper, 35 to 55 kilogram per capita is the global average, ranging from 140 to 300 kilograms of copper per capita in developed economies, to 30 to 40 in developed versus developing. And then similarly with iron, 2,200 kilograms per capita for iron, ranging from 7,000 to 14,000 to 2,000 in developing economies. When it comes to recycling of metals, it doesn't look great. If the orange that you see here, which is there's a lot of orange, it means that that's less than 1% of these metals are actually being recycled. If you look at the orange and the yellow, then you're looking at 25% or less. The blue, and there are some of the blue, is around 50% of those metals are being recycled. So there's a lot of opportunity for recycling of metals. And then finally, assessing global land use, balancing consumption with sustainable supply. Of the 13 billion hectares of ice-free land that we have on the planet, humans now use 8.7 billion for all the stuff that we need. That's intensive agriculture, but also pasture and forestry, not natural forests. 1.47 billion hectares is cultivated, 3.2 billion hectares permanent pasture, and 4 billion hectares is forest and woodland. And the 1.5 billion hectares of cultivated land is where you have the most serious soil degradation, and that has the biggest impact on food consumption. Half the arable land in developing countries is in Brazil, China, and India, 22%, as well as Indonesia and Nigeria. So if you get it right in terms of land use in those 5 countries, you basically have sorted out half the problem. This is a very significant graph, because what this shows is that fertilizer inputs during the period from 60s through to 2010, fertilizer use has rocketed. The purple is phosphorus, potassium. Sorry, these two are phosphorus and potassium, and then what the crop yield is the green line here. So what this is showing is that crop yield is increasing much more slowly than the use of fertilizers, especially nitrogen. And what that is saying is that you're putting more and more chemicals into the soils to get the similar or slightly increased yield. And that is what talks to the fact that we have, in 1990, there were already 23% of soils were degraded. And since then, there's been various world maps of soil degradation, which estimates range between 25 and 35%. So if you look at what the key conclusion of this report is, that business as usual means you're going to need more land. And the low estimate is an additional 71 million hectares of land, and the higher estimates were 300 for biofuels. These are the numbers for biomaterial supply. These are the numbers. And so the net expansion would be, the lowest would be 120 million hectares, which is the FAO number, hunting for new land, up to 500 million hectares. And no one can say that is possible. But if you compensate for the built environment, in other words, the expansion of cities out into farmland, you need another 100 million, at least, maybe up to 130. And if you want to compensate for soil degradation, you need anything between 90 and 225 million. So the gross expansion would be anything between 300 and 850 million extra hectares of land. And when you put all of these numbers together, you realize we have very serious limitations. And so the proposals are halt expansion of global cropland by 2020 at 1.6 billion, restore degraded soils, which could bring into production another 120 million land of low degraded land, not high degraded, at relatively low cost, reduce demand for meat and dairy products, halve the global biofuels targets, in fact, ideally get rid of those targets, limit demand for non-food biomass, and prevent expansion of cities into productive agricultural land. Similarly, a lot of work has been done on water and projected water requirements between 2000 and 2030. Here you see Sub-Saharan Africa being the biggest. At the same time, there is increasing numbers of dead zones, and the water-stressed areas are severe. Here's the brown here. Is the water-stressed areas in OECD, in the BRICS countries. You see it's huge, and in the rest of the world. So these tendencies are getting worse, more and more dead zones, and that goes into flat contradiction with projected demand for water. The solutions being reduced water losses. In some places, it goes up to 50% of the water gets lost along the way. Radical water efficiency measures, especially in agriculture, reconfigure urban water and sanitation systems completely, closed-loop water management systems, decentralization. So, in short, coming back to Marina Fisher-Kowalski's industrial cycles, if we are interested in this transition, the sustainability transition, if we're interested in reconfiguring the complex structures, socio-economic and socio-technical structures for holding exergy and resources, and mobilizing a whole new range of exergies, which is renewable energy, then we're going to have to confront the kind of numbers and realities that I have covered in this. So decoupling will be necessary, and there will be a range of instruments we must think of. We're going to have to build new mechanisms for managing nexus systems like cities, food, green energy, trade, and there are specific resource challenges. In the final analysis, my core conclusion of this chapter is that yes, climate change matters. Yes, the biodiversity crisis matters. But if we ignore resources and resource consumption, we won't really be able to understand the kind of transformation that is required, because the structures that we build, that we call cities, that we call socio-technical systems, that we call economies, to hold exergy and resources, need to fundamentally change if we are going to be able to survive as a species with 9 billion people on a limited planet. So let me stop there. I didn't realize it was going to take this long. Really keen in the next 25 minutes to get some questions and comments. So there's a question. I don't know if people can see this. Last time they couldn't see the questions. The degrowth is interested in the socio-cultural impact as we shift to less resources. And then the degrowthers don't seem to believe that decoupling is a credible solution at the moment, as we are more efficient due to the need for economic growth. We seem to use more into that. Yeah, so I hope people can see that question in the chat. This is a long and complex debate. Prior to the discussion about decoupling, the environmental movement's critique of economic growth was premised on the assumption that economic growth equals increasing resource use. And so if you want to reduce resource consumption, you must reduce growth. And ultimately, you have the no growth or the degrowth movement. Fair enough. However, what the resource flow community have started to show is that there are examples, many examples, of economic growth where you have decoupling. In other words, a decline in the resources required for the same results. For example, the most efficient fridge in the world is a Turkish fridge, uses 5% of the energy of the average fridge and gives you the same amount of cool. That's kind of decoupling. So now that has been critiqued as a framing of the problem that legitimizes economic growth. In other words, you can have economic growth with resource decoupling as a way of greening capitalism, greening growth. And that is clearly a big problem, especially in environments where you don't need any more economic growth. People have enough. In fact, they have too much, and the goal there must be sufficiency, which does mean degrowth, yes, but it can't just be degrowth on its own. You also must pay attention to to changing the resource base. So degrowth on its own is not going to do the trick. You need the institutional or the socio-technical innovations to make sure that even when you are degrowing, you are also becoming a lot more efficient. It's not going to come about just because you're degrowing. There are places in the world which need economic growth, and degrowthers don't always accept that. And like in South Africa being an example, or many other African countries, you do need an increase in the total material consumption of the average population, and not as a mask for increasing inequality. And there again, how do you do that in a way that pays attention to resource efficiency as a way of actually increasing your chances of meeting those needs? So that's a different, those are the different framings of that conversation. So there's a question there on impact on sociocultural and governance systems. So the governance in terms of the integrated resource panel, and which is true for many UN related panels, governance is a tricky issue. Because you're basically building consensus amongst a whole bunch of different nations that have got different governance systems. So on the IRP, China is quite a big player. Then you have all the kind of social democrats from the European Union. You also have the Americans, and you have a bunch of Africans, and Latin Americans. So you know, talking about governance in that context is tricky, but it started to happen. So the Weight of Cities report that I was involved in as a co-lead author ends off with a chapter on what I would now call collaboratory governance, which is a conception of relational governance, which reconciles the need for directionality and complexity. And that's going to be a subject, that's the subject of another chapter in the book, and we'll have a webinar on that. So yes, it has thinking in terms of transition to a more sustainable society, both in terms of CO2 emissions and resource use, means fundamentally dealing with the challenge of what the driver is going to be. And you can't just leave it to the market. And you can't just hope for cultural change. There is a role for state intervention. But how do you understand that? And we don't really have an adequate theory of governance that is appropriate for the reconciliation of complexity with directionality in the context of a transition to a more sustainable world. We just don't have it.
I've promoted everyone to a panelist, so if you have any questions, please do feel free to raise them. Please just unmute yourself, and if you'd like to start your video as well, this is the opportunity.
And there's an anonymous attendee in the Q&A section that I've just seen. In the context of Biden's election and the shift in support for sustainability on the world, so how do you see China's actions changing, particularly because they have such a disproportionate influence globally? Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, China's taken a decision on net zero. China increased its renewable energy last year by 16.6% of its total mix. But China is also extremely sensitive and aware and has a strategy for resources. And that basically boils down to making sure they access and get control of rare earths across the world, even though they have a lot of rare earths themselves. So they're going to hold their own rare earths in reserve and go for the extraction of rare earths around the world first, which would give them massive leverage, because rare earths are absolutely critical, not just for electronics, but for renewable energy infrastructures going forward. So there's a resource game to be played, global power resource game to be played in the renewable sector. And then there's a question around contextualize the idea of radical incrementalism. That's a separate chapter, and we'll have a whole webinar on that. But in essence, what it boils down to is thinking of change not just in terms of a change in structure from one structure to another, which is historically how, especially in Western political thought, we have understood change, from feudalism to capitalism, capitalism to social structures, and what a structuralist an obsession or a fetish with structure allows them to devalue the significance of small-scale changes, which accumulate over time and actually can have more lasting impacts. But I'll do a whole session on that. So,
hi, Mark.
Yes, hi.
It's Thomas.
Hi,
how are
Thomas.
you?
Okay, and you? Good to see you.
Good, thank you. Sorry, we're sitting here in the dark. It's load shedding.
Yes.
So,
the resource challenge.
Yeah, it's a resource challenge. So there's an interesting article that came out in Nature in December last year. Done, I think, some Israeli research institute talking about global human-made mass, anthropogenic mass, that has exceeded, or it's very close to exceeding, the global living biomass at the moment. So my question is, just to get your perspective and opinion on this. This obviously does not bode well for, natural resource use going forward. And how do you see this in context of the future urban resource flow requirements, in terms of meeting those globalization targets by 2050? And are we not potentially and dangerously, I think, nearing some of these type of resource tipping points going into the future? Probably some stuff that we potentially unaware of, that we need to predict and possibly take take some current steps to make sure that we don't exceed those tipping points going forward.
And the tipping point is what? Does this refer to the? Yeah, I'm not familiar with the article. Global anthropogenic materials. So in other words, generate manufactured materials.
Yeah, manufactured materials. So anthropogenic mass, man-made things, cities, cars, whatever the case, has actually exceeded the global biomass, or potentially close to exceeding that biomass. And if we're still going to be putting a lot more constraints on Earth, just in terms of looking at mass comparatively, just quite interesting. What they alluded to in the article was that on an average globally, a single individual consumes or produces equivalent of the weight in 1 week, the same amount of man-made mass. So those types of quantifications are actually quite significant and scary, I think, going forward. And how do you bring that into the work of the IRP and going forward?
I'm just trying to calculate then what would be the total mass of me in 365 days. So 100 kilograms times what? 56. How does that measure up to the 10 tons per capita? It doesn't sound right. But anyway, yeah. So okay. So I understand now where that's coming from, and there is a debate in this whole world about whether it is useful at all to measure to do these measurements in tons, because the argument is some people say, so what? What really matters is not how much, but where you are located in the cycle of resource flows. So if you are consuming 10 tons of resources, of all those different packages of resources, and 5% is recycled, it's completely different to being a 10-ton consumer and 90% is recycled. Because what you're doing is basically, so that argument then says the issue is not so much more or less, the issue is closing loops. And as soon as you can lock people into basically closed loop systems, where there's less and less virgin materials coming in and virtually nothing going out, then you can create sustainable life cycles at fairly high levels of consumption, as long as you have these closed metabolic cycles. And then they become quite emotional, actually, about simply measuring stuff in tons, arguing that actually gets you nowhere. It serves no purpose. I have some sympathy for that view, but the reason I kind of try and kind of straddle that view and the resource consumption view is because I'm an African, and I simply cannot see how we are going to crack the welfare challenge. In other words, if you focus on human welfare, not GDP per capita, if you assume that you can only crack well-being for the majority by reaching a certain level of material consumption. So even if you want to put everybody in cement and you lock them into a closed loop cycle, it's never going to happen. This is never going to happen. There's just certain things that we're just not going to be able to get to. And so we must look at actually doing a hell of a lot more with a lot less. And we must be doing a lot more with stuff we don't currently use, which is the renewables challenge. And where we can lock people in, especially at the urban level, into closed loop systems, let's figure that out. For example, if I had a lot of money, I'd buy up the sewage plants of Africa, because they're going to become a key. We'll be mining them for nutrients, and water systems, sanitation systems, energy systems. It's not that difficult to imagine how you can increase the closed loop, but not as a way of ignoring the resource consumption envelope. That's how I see it.
Thanks, Mark.
Any other questions or comments or reflections? Well, welcome.
Hi, Mark. Yes,
Hi.
It's me, Rudy here.
Hello, Rudy.
Hi there. Been following you from the early days, the Urban Foundation, and all of those days. And what a different environment we have. At the moment, I'm just there for a rural community down south, inland from Amanzimtoti. And the change in that environment, all the invasive and alien plants, it is frightening. Never mind the sprawl, the urban sprawl. So the thing but by the way, I'm a land surveyor by training, but I stopped putting in pegs in 1982. I said, pegs don't help. They definitely not helping. We live in a different system, and we all know that, sorry. So my question is on the one hand is, how do we adjust, and do you see any efforts at changing our education, the curriculums and the things that we need to know about because that's on the one hand, and then on the other hand is what governance systems will be able to cope with this radical transitioning. I like that. I feel for that. Oh, sorry, incremental. The radical incremental. Yeah. Can you comment on those, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I designed and started the first integrated sustainability program there were environmental management programs, but sustainability program and we started in 2003. And at that stage at Stellenbosch University, nobody really could spell sustainability. And there were very few sustainability programs at universities around the world. Now every single self-respecting university around the world in a short space, 20 years, has got not just a sustainability set of degrees from undergrad to postgrad like us, but whole institutes, whole schools, whole centers dedicated to sustainability. So there's been a shift, I think, a significant shift
For sure.
at the tertiary level. And I think that's encouraging, because the reality is that that's actually where it does need to start. And then it filters down through the ideas. And curriculum change at school level is much slower. So yeah, there are various initiatives in the South African context. I'm not that familiar with that world, but it is happening. And around the world, there is a whole new shift in learning paradigm and an amazing new generation of school level institutions that are taking sustainability very seriously. But on your second point on governance, I mean, obviously, when you think of governance, there's the basics. You know, we just can't. You just can't get governance right if you have corruption and all of that kind of stuff. You also can't get. You can't have governance innovations when your regulatory framework is so complex and so so harsh that it actually prevents officials from being innovative, because innovation means taking risks, and when you can get into trouble for taking a risk, then you don't take a risk, then you can't be innovative, and so you're into a mess in that. Where I find the most intelligent thinking taking place is in the Economic Development Partnership in Cape Town, run by Andrew Boraine, where they talk about the kind of top-down authorizing environment which needs to engage with the bottom-up legitimating environment, and that connection between and then facilitate partnering between government departments, between levels of government, and with broader civil society in a way that creates safe spaces for officials, even politicians, to innovate in more collaborative ways. And that's really a paradigm shift and a lot of our work in CSD, which I'll talk about in one of the chapters, is around that, what we call relational governance. How do we shift from a kind of structuralist conception of governance to governance as a set of relationships? And then you need new capacities to facilitate relationships, and you need new intelligences like emotional intelligence and social intelligences, rather than just hierarchical type controlled intelligences. So yeah, and that's a whole separate, completely separate discussion.
Correct, and it makes me think about the thing that the government is at the moment paying some attention to, and that is what they call professionalizing the service.
Yeah,
and I would like to see it as you've described it there, but I'm sure everybody's only looking at higher salaries. That's all they're looking at.
Well, at least, I mean, professionalization essentially boils down to making all salaries consistent, so that you can't just at a local government level just decide to kind of pay yourself a massive amount out of line with the national policy framework. So there's something good about that idea, but it's very structuralist, and it doesn't really pay attention to the relational dynamics that I'm referring to.
Anyway, thanks very much.
Thank
the
you.
Talks are great. Thank you.
So I think we've come at 5:30. Thanks everybody. Thanks Maren for helping me set this up. Much appreciated. Okay, thanks guys.